Hi everyone, welcome to the last series of mini video lectures for History 1305 this semester. Welcome to the last week, our final week, we're going to be talking about what we've been building up to the entire semester, which is the Civil War. Our final week, we're going to be talking about what we've been building up to the entire class, Reconstruction, which is the Civil War. Reconstruction is the period that comes immediately after the Civil War, and it's all about trying to integrate the South. Reconstruction is the period that comes immediately after this is an important subject. And I do want to talk about it a little bit back into the because this is something that this is an important subject, and I do want to talk about it a little bit. Failures when it comes to integrating African Americans into American society. What we're seeing failures when it comes to integrating African American Reconstruction into American society. What we're seeing here is really critical rights as citizens during Reconstruction. African Americans are beginning in the American South really critical rights that will deny them these rights. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit. But I am going to deal with it briefly because that is really a topic that gets covered. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit, but I am going to deal with it briefly because we're going to start right away dealing with the election of 1860 because this is truly the beginning of the Civil War. We're going to start right away dealing with the election of 1860. Democrats have sort of survived the geographic split we were talking about. In 1860, we see the Democrats have sort of survived the geographic split we were talking about. The party that had come in to replace the Whigs were the Republicans who were running under that solely on the abolitionist platform. Come in to replace the Whigs were really looking at to run slavery across every inch of American soil. They were really looking at the election of 1860. The Democrats are completely divided. Soil. They're divided between North and South. In the election of 1860, the Southern Democrats are completely divided. They're divided between North and South Carolina. And so the Southern Democrats are going to hold it. They're putting this guy by the name of John in South Carolina. Breckinridge is an incredibly hardcore pro-slavery a guy by the name of John. So he's really representing Breckinridge is an incredibly hardcore pro-slavery advocate. Couldn't get behind. So he's really representing that pro-slavery Stephen Douglas. We last saw him Northern Democrats establishing the Kansas and Nebraska. So they're going to support Stephen Douglas. We last saw him. So what we have here is at the convention, Nebraska, the Northern and Southern Democrats cannot agree on their candidate. So what we have here is at the convention, this is not a good way to win an election. Cannot agree on their candidate. Unified party and Democrats forward. To make this is not a good way to win an election for the Democrats against a unified party Whigs and Know Nothing. To make matters even worse, party that we for the Democrats is former Southern Whigs and Know Nothing candidate, anti-immigration, and he's kind of a pro-slavery lecture. So what this is going to do is it's going to really fracture the Joe Bell, and he's kind of a pro-slavery moderate. Slavery. So what this is going to do is it's going to really fracture the votes, breaking them into behind slavery and the votes that are represented out as the only unified party. Breaking their candidate has the support of every Republican, and that is Abraham come out as the only unified Abraham Lincoln. And their candidate has the support of every Republican, and that is Abraham Lincoln from Illinois. Abraham Lincoln really puts himself on the national stage, senatorial hopeful from Stephen Douglas, and he really puts himself on the national stage when he embarrasses Stephen Douglas. Ultimately, because the Democrats are so fractured, and Lincoln and the Republicans are unified, it's going to be a pretty easy road to the White House. Are so fractured, Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans are unified. It's going to be a pretty easy road to the White House. Immediately is going to Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party. When he wins this election, they are freaking out. Immediately is fearing that this doesn't just mean the end of slavery in the American West, in the territories that America has been acquiring. They're fearing that this doesn't just mean the end of slavery in the American West, the end of slavery in the American South. Acquiring. They're concerned that this also is going to lead to the end of slavery in the American South. He doesn't take office until January of 1860. Before Lincoln's even taken office, believing that the election of the Republican president is an automatic assault on slavery, South Carolina to announce that they are the election of a Republican president is an automatic assault on slavery. They are going to announce that they are seceding from the United States. They're breaking away. And so ultimately what they're going to choose to do is say we no longer want to be a part of the United States of America. And so ultimately what they're going to choose to do is say we no longer want to be a part of the United States of America. And it's important to understand the process. Republican president hasn't taken office. We're not going to be a part of this. Lincoln on the campaign trail was talking about ending slavery in the West. Lincoln hasn't taken office. Not allowing Lincoln on the campaign trail was talking about ending slavery in the West. On southern slavery, not allowing it to expand. But South Carolina is not going to wait around to see what southern slavery. They don't wait until he shape or form. Pushes for any legislation. South Carolina is not going to wait around to simply going to say if Lincoln's president, we're out of here. Pushes for any legislation. So very shortly after that, they're just simply going to say if Lincoln's president, Mississippi, we're out of here. Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas, the next two going to follow Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas are all going to no longer a part of the Union. We are seceding. Representatives in Congress are all going to stand up and say we are no longer a part of Alabama. We are the first capital of the Confederacy. And they pack their bags and they leave. They go down to Montgomery, Alabama, which is the first capital. Politicians are going to draft up a new constitution. So it looks nearly identical to the Constitution of the United States, with the exception of a new constitution. It has explicit allowances identical to the Constitution of the United States, with the exception these Confederate States of America. Allowances and that's the name that they are going to go by. Slavery is legal lecture when I say the States of America, the Confederacy, and that's the name that they are going to go by. States of America, or the lecture when I say the South. We're talking about the secessionist or the Confederate States of America that have broken away and are no longer part of the United States. We're talking about the secessionist states. Those politicians are also going to elect a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis, a Mississippian, to be the president. Those politicians are also going to elect a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis, in the North, a Mississippian, to be the president by this entire process. They can't believe that all these southern states have now simply broken away aback by this entire process. They can't believe that all these southern states have now simply broken away. One of them is John Crittenden, moderates who are hoping that they can from Kentucky fix this fracture before it comes to warfare. He is basically going to say, look, we need to be rational, we need to find a compromise. He is basically going to say, we need to be rational, we need to find a compromise. This is happening in 1861, very early on, called the Crittenden. What the plan basically says is we need to go back to the Missouri Compromise, very early on. The plan basically says is we need to go back to the Missouri Compromise line, the imaginary line that runs and basically what that's going to say is he says let's just extend that to the Pacific and longitude, and then we'll be good. And basically what that's going to say is he says let's just extend that to the Pacific, anything below that, and then we'll be good. Everyone will be happy, and anything above it, slavery would be illegal. And so anything below that, Lincoln nor Jefferson Davis are going to accept this compromise. Neither side is willing to bend. Neither Lincoln nor Jefferson Davis are going to accept this compromise. Neither side is willing to bend. I have one promise to the American people: slavery will not move westward at all. That is my promise. I have one promise to the American people: slavery will not move westward at all, because that is my promise. So if he takes this compromise, he's breaking his own promise. This doesn't work for Jefferson Davis. Would extend because Jefferson Davis knows the lands that he's getting on the flip side. This doesn't work for Jefferson Davis. Slavery is not going to be because Jefferson Davis knows the lands that he's getting are not going to allow slavery to go to the parts of the country where slavery is not going to be actually profitably expand. So neither side accepts allow slavery to go to the parts of the country where slave labor could actually be feasible. Compromise. So neither side accepts this compromise. Davis, for his part, believes that hopefully if we break away and we mind our own business, Davis, for his part, believes that hopefully Lincoln on his end is thinking and we mind our own business. This is the way the South is trying to basically make big threats. Lincoln on his end is thinking this is over slavery. This is the way that the South is trying to basically make big threats and get necessarily see this as leading to an inevitable conflict that can't be resolved. Neither one of them at the outset necessarily see this as leading to an inevitable conflict. It's looking more and more likely that armed conflict will be the only way they're going to be able to deal with this schism. It's looking more and more likely that armed conflict going to put his foot down on the issue. They're going to be able to deal with this schism. Okay, you've broken away. So Lincoln is finally going to put his foot down on the issue. What Lincoln says is, okay, you've broken away. You've declared that the federal government owns in southern lands from the United States. It still belongs to the federal government. He actually declares secession as unconstitutional. It still belongs to the federal government. More importantly, he actually declares secession as unconstitutional. He starts that exist in the American South. More importantly, what he says is they still belong to the United States of America. Forts that exist in the American South and these territories. They still belong to the United States of America. And he federally owns lands in these areas in the secession state. Just because he broke away doesn't mean they belong. And so he's basically saying these areas in the secessionist state, just because he broke away doesn't mean they belong to you. They still run short in some of these military encampments in the South. In particular, the food and supplies start to run short in some of these military encampments for the war. In particular, South Carolina known as Fort Sumter. They're jumping off federal troops who are stationed there are South Carolina known as Fort Sumter. And Lincoln sends the governor of South Carolina troops who are stationed there are running low on food and supplies. And Lincoln sends the governor of South Carolina and the men who are staying there. He says, "I'm sending down and he's basically trying to say that they're going to resupply the fort and the men who are staying there. Our fort and our property, and we are going to resupply it, whether or not you recognize the United States or not, and our property, and we are going to resupply it, whether or not you recognize or allowing for these supplies to be dropped off." But the Confederacy is waiting for the ship to arrive or allowing for these supplies to be dropped off. Who are holed up in Fort Sumter. The Confederacy is going to essentially just start to attack the Union soldiers who are holed up in Fort Sumter. This is largely seen as the beginning of the Fort Sumter in early 1861. General Beauregard is going to be leading the Confederate troops in the raid on that fort, and they will successfully take Fort Sumter. General Beauregard is going to be leading the Confederate troops in the raid on that fort, and they will successfully take Fort Sumter from the Union. Well in spirit. So the American Civil War is definitely being fought over this contentious issue of slavery. Well in spirit. Politically, the American Civil War is definitely being fought over this contentious break away or secede from the Union. Politically, the war is actually about Lincoln's rhetoric southern states to break away or secede from the Union. We're taking your slaves. You have to understand that Lincoln's rhetoric. That's not how Lincoln is approaching this. We're taking there's a couple of reasons why we're fighting this war over slavery. That's not how Lincoln is approaching this. And there's a couple of reasons what this is all about, and we'll get into those as this lecture goes on. That the South doesn't have a right to secede. Ultimately, what this is all about for the North is about it's about the fact that the South doesn't have a right to secede. He says that the war for the North is about maintaining in response to the attack on Fort Lincoln after the Confederacy raises its flag above the fort and claims it as their own. In response to the attack on Fort Lincoln as the Confederacy raises its flag above the fort and claims it as their own, Lincoln will declare the Lower South as an attack on the United States. And ultimately, he will call for 75,000 Northerners to enlist in the Union Army. And ultimately, he will call for 75,000 Northerners. This does not look like it's going to be much of a war at all. It looks like it's going to go by really quickly. This does not look like it's going to be much of a war at all. It looks like it's going to go by really quickly. The South and that's going to be the end of it. The North has an incredible advantage. If you were looking at this war on paper, but the South has no chance. The attitude is clear. Basically, when you start to look at Northern newspapers, Northern journalists, when they're talking about this, clear. They're saying basically when you start to look at Northern newspapers, Northern journalists, it's going to be over. Talking about this, Jefferson Davis and all the people who have been in this going to win decisively. It's going to be over quickly. They're all going to be swinging Davis and all the people who have been in this sort of state of insurrection. They don't see this war all going to be swinging from the battlements in Washington. As we know, this is going to drag on for a number of years. And so they don't see this war as lasting more than a few months. The North looks poised to absolutely this is going to drag on for a number of years. But on paper, following through the slideshow with me, you'll see that I've given you a table there that sort of compares the advantages that the North has over the South. You'll see that I've given you a table there. When we look at these advantages, they pretty much advantages that the North has to winning this war in every decisive area that you would need in a conflict hold the key to winning this war in every decisive area that you would need in a conflict or there's simply way more people in the North. The Union population, the Union also has a massive advantage in terms of manufacture. They manufacture the vast majority of the weapons in the United States. Advantage in terms of manufacture. Weapons. They also able to manufacture non-military supplies as well. They can make clothing, boots. They're also able to manufacture non-military supplies as well, insulated on the battlefield. Boots. They are producing more medicine to sort of stay when you look at it, you see that basically insulated on the battlefield. They're producing more medicine of the weapons and ammunition that basically in the Union. Now, obviously in a war, this is going to give you weapons and ammunition. When we talk about railroad miles, now obviously in a war, this is going to give you their supplies to the battlefield. When we talk about railroad, they have over 22,000 miles of railway, whereas the South only has 9,000 to the battlefield. And that 9,000 they have over 22,000 miles of railway, whereas the South only has 9,000 out to the coast. And that 9,000 is mainly meant to move capital. You need a lot of money to win a war. Produce products out to the coast. The Union holds about 330 million. You need a lot of money to in terms of banking capital. The Union holds about $300 billion in terms of banking capital. Overall, the North compares that to the U.S. South, they only have about 27 million. Ideologically, there's an overall the North just holds this massive advantage. What they're going to be able to do, ideologically, they're going to say there's an advantage for the North. Part of the people in the North, they don't care about what they're going to be able to do. Slavery doesn't matter. Is they're going to say an important issue. They're not willing to go and die for it. They don't care about slavery. Slavery doesn't matter. For those people, the North can say this war is not willing to go and die for it. This is about the fact that they illegally seceded from the United States, and they are breaking our beloved Union apart. This is about the fact that they illegally seceded from the United States, and they are breaking our beloved Union apart. If you're an abolitionist, and so they have a sort of two-pronged attack of getting over this issue of slavery in the North. If you're not an abolitionist, and you don't care about slavery, then you should be fighting for your patriotic duty. You should be fighting to hold the United States together. Then you should be fighting for your patriotic duty. The North is going to be able to hold the United States into this conflict. And so that's a major advantage that the North is going to be able to have about in this mini lecture video is the Southern response to this now. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this mini lecture video is the Southern response. They don't have a well-established army. The South doesn't have all this material advantage. They don't have type of rhetoric. They don't have a well-established people involved in the war. They mostly what they're going to do is they're going to go different type of rhetoric to get the American Revolution. They're going to start to cast what they're going to do is they're going to go back to the American Revolution. What they're saying is that their rights are being trampled upon by an oppressive federal Confederacy. What they're saying is that telling people that being trampled upon by an oppressive and attacking you in your home. They're going to be able to start telling people that your rights. This is the North coming in and attacking you and do your patriotic duty to ensure your inalienable rights away. And so you need to stand up and do your patriotic duty to ensure your inalienable rights. Do not own slaves. We're talking about a demographic in the South where the vast majority of Southern whites do not own slaves. In fact, a very small proportion of the South is directly invested in overall population. So the question becomes, in fact, a very small proportion of the South is directly invested in this war. So the question becomes, how do we get them to lay their lives on the line for the Confederacy and for the issue of slavery from which they don't profit? Get them to lay their lives on the line for the Confederacy, a lot of rhetoric and for the issue of slavery from which they don't profit. Essentially what the South is going to say is that a lot of rhetoric surrounding Abraham radical Republican people essentially what the South is going to say just want to end slavery in the South. They want to make us radical Republican people they want to basically enslave you to African Americans. They want to that is the rhetoric that's going around the South. They want Abraham Lincoln to enslave you to African Americans. And that is the rhetoric that's going around the South. They're saying Abraham Lincoln is going to get the poorer segments of Southern society to throw their support behind the Confederacy and behind the war. They're going to get the poorer segments of Southern society to throw their support behind the Confederacy and behind the war advantages that the South has. And so in addition to that, there's this other, they are the ones who will be taking a defensive posture advantages that the South has. And it is far easier to get people on your side taking a defensive posture throughout this war. If the North and it is far easier to get people on your side into the South for your war effort in your home state. Northern armies it's easy to say armies are coming into the South and attacking you in your home state. And it's also it's easy to say we need to defend our home. We're fight on the defensive than it is to mount a successful military outlook. It's always far easier to fight on the defensive than it is to mount a successful tiptoeing around and perhaps the biggest advantages they're going to have and see it. For the South, sort of been tiptoeing around and military leadership. Biggest advantage, as historians tend to see it, for the South in the Civil War is they have military leadership. Their officers does not have good military leadership. They're all high-ranking officials, but very few of them have seen their officers, their generals. Very few of them have high-ranking officials, but very few of them have seen. This is not true of the South. The Southern generals, people like Robert E. Lee, led troops into war. This is not true of the South. These guys are generals, people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, American, General Beauregard. These guys are all guys who have seen active conflict. They have actually led troops into battle, and they really know what they're doing. In the Northern leadership is more accustomed to sitting in offices into battle, and they really know what they're doing. In fancy uniforms. The Northern leadership is more accustomed to sitting in offices up in the North. People who are appointed basically because of their social status and going to high society parties about active people who are appointed basically because of their social status. This is going to give the South a key advantage when actual combat really break out, and we start looking at the early campaigns of the war. This is going to give the South a key advantage when actual conflict starts to really break out, and we start looking at the early campaigns of the war. At some of the early conflicts. This mini lecture video, we'll be picking it up immediately after this and starting to look at some of the initial battle has taken place at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And we've looked at the sort of northern advantage and the southern advantages as both sides are coming into this conflict. And a few days after the conflict at Fort Sumter, the Union is very successful at meeting Lincoln's demands for 75,000 enlisted troops in the Union Army. The people who initially sign up for service agree to 90 days of service. And this should show you what Lincoln is thinking about this war. He's not asking for 4 years of commitment from these soldiers. He's not asking for, 3 years. He's not asking for a year. He's asking for 3 months. That's how quickly he sees this war coming to an end. In addition to that, Lincoln is going to basically starve out the South. They're following what's known as the Anaconda Plan. Basically, if you're familiar with the anaconda, it's a big constricting snake that lives in the Amazon. What the North wants to do to the South is completely surround it and isolate it. Block it off so that no supplies can come in or out. Because as we saw, looking at those numbers going into the war, the South cannot sustain itself. It doesn't have enough internal manufacturing, internal weapons production, internal banking capital, or internal sort of manpower to really sustain the war effort. So as part of this, he needs to block off the West. Obviously, the North is blocked by the boundary lines between the North and South, but he also needs to blockade the South. And he's going to do this along the southern coast of the U.S., both along the Atlantic coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. Volunteers crammed into recruiting stations in the North. It was not difficult to meet that 75,000 troop number. In fact, the Union recruiters are actually turning potential troops away at the beginning of the war. That's how many people were willing to go and fight against this process of secession. Now, among the people who are trying to volunteer at the outset of the war are African Americans living in the North. But these soldiers would be turned away for the first few years of conflict. Lincoln does not want African American soldiers fighting alongside the white volunteers. There's a few key reasons for this. We still are not at a point, I've pointed it out again and again in this class. Belief in abolition does not mean belief in racial equality. And so they don't believe that African Americans are fit to fight alongside white soldiers, but there is a more practical and less ideological reason here. And that is the fact that Lincoln knows that if he allows African American soldiers to pick up weapons and go fight white Americans in the South, this will damage his reputation and his ability to maintain what we call the border states. The border states are a key thing that you need to take away from this lecture. Because what's happening here is there's this assumption that the entire country splits north and south, everybody takes a side, and then everybody goes to war. But that is not the reality. There are a number of slaveholding states that choose not to break away, that stay with the Union. Those states are Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri. All 4 of those border states will maintain their alliance with the Union, although it's difficult to hold on to these states. Now, in these states where slavery is legal, but they're still supporting the war effort for the Union, if you take in African American slaves, this damages your ability to maintain these states. And so we're going to look at those 4 border states individually as the lecture moves on, but that's largely his reasoning for not allowing African American soldiers to join the war effort at the outset. Now, as I mentioned, despite the fact that the North easily hits their troop numbers, it easily is going to be able to meet these requirements to go to war, they don't have real troops. They have a bunch of non-professional soldiers. These are people who work in other professions. They don't have any combat experience, and so they're getting a bunch of green recruits, people who have never really seen active conflict on the battlefield. Now, despite the fact that only 1/3 of the U.S.'s military leadership breaks away and goes with the South, that third of the leadership, as I've already pointed out, they are the ones with real military battlefield experience. They are the ones who actually know how to command troops in war. Whereas the leadership in the North, the Union leadership, the generals and the commanders for the Union, are really more politically connected people who are just well positioned in society. They're more accustomed to parading with their soldiers, like I said, in fancy uniforms. When these troops are pouring into recruiting stations in 1861, they have yet to get this unified sort of look to the Union Army. They haven't adopted that full blue uniform that we're used to seeing today. But very quickly, they're going to get rid of the fancy sort of European-esque military outfits. Each regiment wore, they had their own different outfit, and they start to go with the general blue for the Union by 1862, whereas the South will adopt the familiar gray military uniforms that we see on the slides there if you're going through the slideshow. So, in order to mobilize troops for the South, it's a little bit of a different process going on there. The Confederacy has different problems altogether. It's not about military experience or military leadership. It's about the fact that they don't have an army to begin with. They have to build everything from scratch. This is a brand new nation. And so what they're going to do is use local and state militias in the South. They start expanding and reorganizing these militias. So they start working with the militias to start turning them into the Confederate Army. And they're successful in doing this by March of 1861 because they have good leadership. They're able to quickly get these recruits. And these militias had largely sort of collapsed into drinking clubs for the most part. But the Southern leadership is going to be able to whip them back into shape and get them ready to fight by March of 1861. Now, in order to fight Lincoln's naval blockade, the South, or the Confederacy, they don't have a navy, and so they have a problem here. And we're going to go back to what we saw in the American Revolution and in previous battles that we've looked at. What the South is going to do is effectively turn to privateering. They're going to employ pirates to go and steal Union ships, and then they're going to turn those Union ships around and start fighting other Union ships with them. This is not meant to actually win a naval engagement. What it's meant to do is distract the naval blockade that the North has put into place long enough to allow supply ships to come in and drop off weapons, food, clothing, ammunition, everything they need to support the war effort in the South. So, despite an aggressive push to build a navy and to build up manufacturing centers in the South is not really ever going to be able to do this in the way that they need to. A common theme throughout this war is that the South is undersupplied. They simply don't have what they need. You'll hear a lot of stories about them essentially having to scour battlefields when the battles have come to a close. They're going and picking up unspent shells. They're picking up weapons that are still functional. They're pulling boots off of dead soldiers because they don't have enough for their troops. And so this is it'll be happening all throughout the course of the war. But really what I'm trying to point out here and what this means is that the Confederacy is going to need to turn to foreign allies. They need to turn to European nations to help them sustain their war effort. By the end of the war, the number that we're looking at is about 700,000 weapons are going to be imported to the Confederacy from abroad. And their main trade partner is going to be England. England will be supporting the South throughout the war. And it's not until you see some really high-profile incidents where the Union caught some of these supply ships that the British are going to back off and start removing their support from the South. Now, with virtually no banks and no currency in the South, they don't use the U.S. dollar anymore because they're not part of the United States. What they're going to do is start just arbitrarily printing their own money in the South. The Confederacy would print over $1 billion Confederate dollars by 1864. There's a problem here. They're printing paper money, but it doesn't mean anything. This leads to hyperinflation in the South. They are really dealing with a massive economic problem there. And so they're going to have 9,000% inflation by 1863. What this means is that the Confederate money is ample, but it's useless. You can't buy any real common household products with it without having thousands and thousands of Confederate dollars. And so, with all of these issues going on, they also, ironically, are going to start to have states versus federal rights going on in the South. So effectively, the South is saying that the federal government of the United States trampled on their states' rights. But once the Confederacy is its own independent government, they have a hard time compelling the individual states within it, places like Alabama and Mississippi, to give the requisite number of troops or weapons or food for the war effort. So they're constantly going to be dealing with economic and supply problems in the South. This will be an ongoing issue for the Confederacy from the beginning of the war all the way until the end. So it's something to keep in mind as we keep talking through some of the battles that we'll be encountering. Now, with all that said, we've talked about the North and how they've mobilized troops. We've talked about the South and how they have tried to mobilize their armies. This leaves us with those sort of nebulous areas in the middle, what we call the border states. Not every single slaveholding state in the United States broke away with the South. Their state leaders are going to desire to keep slavery. And remember, Lincoln hasn't made slavery illegal. He hasn't made any sort of orders of that nature. And so there are these border states that are going to say, we want to keep our slaves, but we also don't want to break away and fight against the United States in a war. And so ultimately, the border states are going to be Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. So those four states all hold slaves throughout the Civil War, but they all support the Union war effort. They're all part of the Union throughout the war. Now, these states are of incredible strategic importance, and we're going to look at each one as we go through. Kentucky and Missouri are both really important because they provide really critical riverine access for the Union. In other words, if you hold Kentucky and Missouri, you can easily move your troops out to the Mississippi River. And the Ohio River valleys are running through Kentucky as well. And so if you've got access to these two rivers, you can use boats to move your materials and your troops really quickly. And so that's why those two areas are going to be of high importance, both to the Union and to the Confederacy. Delaware is another important state because it provides a buffer zone between the Confederacy and a very important sort of manufacturing center in the North in Philadelphia. If you take Philadelphia away, you can basically move Confederate boats right. If you take Delaware away, you can move boats right up to Philadelphia and start bombarding the city. And that is a huge manufacturing center for the North. Finally, Maryland is arguably the most important of the border states. When you look at where Washington, D.C. is at on a map, it is wedged in between Virginia in the south and Maryland in the north. So Washington, D.C. is right there in the middle. So Virginia is quickly going to become the capital of the Confederacy. They're going to move it out of Montgomery, Alabama, and up to Richmond, Virginia early in the war effort. So Virginia is a Confederate state. And so on the south, Washington, D.C. is bordered by the Confederacy. In the north, that's Maryland. If they lose Maryland, the capital of the United States will be surrounded by Confederate territory. So it is of critical importance that they hold that area. Now, when we look at this economically and militarily, this is important as well because if you were to take those four states and say they're not part of the Union anymore, they've now moved to the Confederacy. That would represent 80% of Southern manufacturing. You would be upping their manufacturing abilities by 80%, just taking those four states and having them move to the Confederacy. And it would also make up nearly half of the Southern white male population, the people who are fighting in this war. And so it is a huge manpower and manufacturing power advantage for the Union to maintain those states. And it's not so much that the Union needs the manpower from those states or needs the manufacturing from those states. It's that the South needs it very badly, and the North needs to make sure they don't get it. And so they're going to be holding on to those border states for dear life. And Lincoln's going to have to take some drastic steps in order to hold these states. And we'll see what those are in a few slides coming up here. But there's one more reason these border states are important. The South is saying this war is about them trying to take our slaves away. And Lincoln's saying this is about secession and the fact that you've broken away illegally. So it's hard. It gives the Union a key sort of rhetorical advantage in all of this to have those states. Lincoln can go, look, it's not about slavery because 4 slave states are fighting with us, not with you. And so it gives them that sort of advantage in rhetoric. And as we're moving forward on the slides here, you can look in that map and the border states are in red. And so that'll show you where those areas are on the map and why they're so important. And you'll also see a sort of interesting caveat I want to point out here. It won't be on an exam, but it's interesting to see. You will see that West Virginia is outlined as part of the Union there, and it's obviously, as the name suggests, on the western side of Virginia. Now, West Virginia doesn't actually come into existence until 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. They break away because they do not want to be part of Virginia. This is a mountainous area. There are poor people up there who live in the mountains. They don't own slaves. They don't care about slavery. That's not their problem. And so they choose to form an independent state out of the western part of Virginia because they do not want to be part of the Confederacy. And so they will automatically join up with the Union when they declare their independence from Virginia. Now, to wrap up this little mini lecture video, we're going to talk about how Lincoln will maintain these border states. In the end, the Union will hold all of them, all throughout the course of the war, but it's not going to be easy. Delaware is arguably the easiest state to hold because Delaware, only 2% of their population owns slaves in the first place. Slavery's not that big of an institution there. So it's pretty easy for them. They're never really threatening to leave the Union in the first place because slavery is not a huge issue to them. Kentucky is kind of split in half between pro-Confederate and pro-Union leanings. But Lincoln is able to essentially hold on to this state and negotiate with their state leadership throughout the war. And he's also going to have to send in federal troops at one point and reinforce the state to ensure that Kentucky maintains its ties to the Union. Now, Maryland is definitely going to be a problem for Lincoln. And that's because Maryland has a very large slaveholding population relative to the other states in the upper South or what we could call the mid-Atlantic region. Now, they have a strong pro-Confederate sentiment there. And ultimately, when the Confederacy is sort of trying to pull Maryland in, the Union is struggling to hold on to them. But Maryland, as I talked about, it's of key geographic importance. The Union Army is trying to march the 6th Regiment from Massachusetts down through Maryland, and they're trying to get them into the border of Virginia, into Washington, D.C., on the border of Virginia. And as these troops are marching down, pro-Confederate sympathizers start basically attacking these troops in April of 1861. The Union soldiers are going to return fire on them. They actually fire on these crowds of Confederate sympathizers, and a mob begins to form. In order to continue to control Maryland, Lincoln has to start suspending civil law and civil rights in Maryland. He says the whole area is now under martial law. The Union Army is going to be under control of Maryland to make sure we don't lose it. In addition to that, he starts suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Now, I don't want to get too much into United States legal history, but this is an important law. What he's going to be able to do by suspending the writ of habeas corpus is he's going to be able to arrest Confederate sympathizers, throw them in jail, and never present them with their supposed crimes or charges. He's going to be able to lock up Confederate sympathizers for the duration of the war without ever really bringing fair charges against them in a court of law. He also will start basically summarily having the courts judge people without them being able to be present in court and defend themselves. So this is a big problem for Lincoln. Because the South's down there going, Abraham Lincoln's a tyrant. He wants to enslave white people to African Americans. That's what he's really all about. He wants to be the king of the United States and put African Americans in charge. And when he starts violating the civil rights of people of Maryland, this gives more fodder to the South. They go, aha, you see, that's what Lincoln thinks of your inalienable rights. That's what he thinks of your civil rights. He doesn't care about it. He will suspend them and get rid of them on the drop of a hat if it suits him because he's a king, he's not a president. And so it really reinforces a lot of that rhetoric that's driving poor whites in the South to the recruiting stations, getting them to join this Confederate war effort. Ultimately, in Missouri, what happens there is a little quasi-civil war breaks out. The Confederacy supports a small army there, and the Union supports a small army there. But under the command of a guy named Nathaniel Lyon, a military general from the North, the Union troops are going to be able to hold Missouri and make sure that they stay a part of the Union. So the Union is going to be able to maintain these border states, and that is critical for two reasons. One, it deprives the South of this badly needed military and manufacturing and manpower advantage that they would have gotten if they took them. Secondly, it will continue to push this idea that the war is not about slavery, it is about secession. It is about illegally breaking away from the United States. So that will wrap up this little mini lecture video. We're going to move on to the actual warfare in the early campaigns in the next video. But I want you to really pay attention to what's going on with the border states, as that is going to form a big portion of your final exam. Okay, we've discussed some of the critical issues leading up to the real heavy conflict of the Civil War, which will really be starting in 1861, particularly in July of 1861. But as we know, the South at the outset of this war took a defensive posture. They're going to kind of hold back and force the North to attack them. This gives them and their weaker manpower a strategic sort of position from which they're fighting on the defensive. It always takes more troops and more manpower to mount an offensive sort of position in a war. And so there are a lot of people in the South that are saying what we ought to do is just go up north and slam them, because we can get this early decisive victory. That's going to lead to more foreign powers, places like England and Spain and France, supporting us in our war effort. But the military leadership there knows that this is probably not the most practical solution if warfare becomes a little bit more prolonged and dragged out. In the North, people are calling for the same thing. They are demanding, this secession thing has gone on for months now. We need to just put this war to an end. And the North thinks that they can do that. But a Northern general by the name of Winfield Scott is going to come up with a plan that I've already talked about, the Anaconda Plan. The goal is to completely surround the South, blockade them, and then crush on them from the outside in, forcing them to ultimately surrender. Both sides want this early decisive victory in the war. Both the commanders and leadership on both sides are kind of going, that's not the best tactic to take right now. The first major battle that we'll be talking about in the Civil War is the First Battle of Bull Run, which occurs in July of 1861 in Manassas, Virginia. So what happens here is that 30,000 Union troops are going to march down to try to take a key railway junction that's in Manassas, Virginia. And what they're hoping to do is take this railway junction to cut off supplies coming into the Confederate capital. So the troops that march down are collectively known as the Army of the Potomac. Now, they march south from D.C. They're going to go and attack and try to hold this railroad junction in Manassas, Virginia. And the battle does not go the North's way. It initially looks like it's going to, but when another offensive gets there from the South, when the Confederacy launches a heavier attack, the Northern troops start to show their inexperience. They break rank and they start retreating. They make this really haphazard, sort of hasty retreat, and they all start running back towards Washington, D.C. And so the Northern soldiers are here. They're just showing that inexperience, that inability to really hold themselves on the battlefield. The South is going to be emboldened by this victory. They're feeling very confident after this battle at Manassas, Virginia, the First Battle of Bull Run. And the Union defeat starts to make it painfully clear to the Union that this isn't going to be the quick, easy, decisive war we thought it was. The South is really ready for a fight. They're really ready to take us on in this war. And so they have to kind of fall back and regroup and start thinking about what are we really engaging in here? What is this war really going to look like? And within a week of that defeat at Manassas, the First Battle of Bull Run, Lincoln will change his tune quite a bit. Initially, he says, I need 75,000 guys, and I need them for 90 days. All of a sudden, he's going, I need 1 million soldiers, and I need them for 3 years. So you can see that the North has changed its attitude towards this war. This is not going to be a quick, easy, crush them and it's done kind of war. This is going to be a long, protracted series of battles that will really test the patience of the Northern leadership and of people in Northern society. At this point, Lincoln is going to turn to a general by the name of George McClellan to help rebuild the Army of the Potomac. This is a big problem, and it's going to become a major theme throughout the early years of the war, up until 1863, 1864. McClellan and Lincoln hate one another. They absolutely cannot stand one another. McClellan's attitude is that Lincoln is a president. He needs to keep his nose out of military business. His job is that of a politician, not of a military commander. And so whenever Lincoln gives him an order, McClellan is going to go, I don't need your orders, don't tell me what to do. Whereas Lincoln sees himself as the commander-in-chief of the Union Army and feels that when he gives an order to his generals, those orders should be followed. Now there's a problem here. McClellan and Lincoln hate each other, but McClellan's men, the soldiers who serve underneath him, love him. And so it's not going to be so easy to get rid of McClellan once he is in command of the Army of the Potomac. And he very quickly is able to whip them back into shape and rebuild that into a 150,000-man strong army. While that's going on over in Virginia, which is really the epicenter of warfare, is going to be northern Virginia, that sort of boundary line between Virginia, Washington, D.C., and Maryland. There is another arena of warfare going on that they call the Western Frontier. With the Union's defeat at Bull Run, they are going to really need to manage some early victories out west. The armies out there are under the command of, at this point, a virtual unknown to the sort of overall power structure of the Union Army. It's a guy by the name of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, for his part, is not well liked within the military. He's been actually censured and sort of disciplined for previous problems that he had with drinking. The guy's a bit of an alcoholic. But he is a very astute military commander. And in February of 1862, Grant gets some decisive victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. And this is going to drive the Confederate forces from Kentucky and Tennessee entirely. So he keeps pushing them back. He's forcing them out of the upper South. And he's driving them back towards the deep South. And the whole plan here is, again, part of that larger scheme of the Anaconda Plan. The Union wants to take control of the Mississippi River, so they need to push the Confederate forces out of there so that they control the upper Mississippi. Now, while he and his men are camped at a place called Shiloh Church, Tennessee, the Confederate armies spring a surprise attack on Grant and his men, and they almost wipe his forces out. This almost ends the push and the march that the Union armies are making on the western frontier. But Grant, again, being a very good military leader, he's able to hold his men together, withstand the siege at Shiloh Church, and he waits for reinforcements to arrive. When they do, he's able to beat back the Confederates there, and then it starts to become a very clear march southward. By June of 1862, Grant has pushed the Confederates in the Mississippi River all the way down south to Vicksburg, Mississippi. So he is very successful at creating this western boundary from which they can start to choke out the Confederacy. This does a few other things as well. Some of the western Confederate states are going to be made largely obsolete. Places like Texas are not going to be able to help the war effort as much if the heart of the Confederacy is blocked at the Mississippi River. And so Grant keeps pushing down from the north and pushing down the Mississippi River Valley. And at the same time, the Union Navy is under the command of a guy named General David Farragut. They are going to launch a decisive attack on New Orleans, and they're going to win in that Battle of New Orleans there. And so what that does is it wipes the Confederacy out in the Mississippi River Valley. Grant pushes down from the north, Farragut comes up from New Orleans in the south, and they meet together, and they've now split the Confederacy in two. And they've created that western boundary from which they can start to choke out the heart of the Confederacy. as much as we have some issues going on in Virginia for the Union, the battles out on the western frontier underneath Ulysses S. Grant are very, very successful in the early years of the war. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of the early campaigns, what's happening from 1861 to 1863, is what's known as the Peninsular Campaign. This is going to really highlight that animosity between General McClellan and Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln is ultimately very pleased with what's happening out west, with Grant's progress out there. And he thinks, right now is the time to strike. The iron's hot. We've got the Confederacy scrambling out west. Let's launch another attack towards their capital in Richmond, Virginia. And so he wants to take on the armies of Northern Virginia, who are really going to be the sort of heart of the Confederate power. And he turns again to McClellan in order to do this. He says, McClellan, we've got to attack. But McClellan, again, just not liking the fact that he has to take orders from a non-military figure like Lincoln, he says, no, my men aren't ready. And he stalls. He holds the men up and he waits. And the problem is that ultimately this is going to really create, again, this tension between Lincoln and McClellan, but it also is going to give the South a chance to reinforce Richmond. And so he says, nah, my men aren't ready. And Lincoln says, I don't care. I gave you an order, attack, and attack right now. So if you look at a map, to march out of Washington, D.C. into Richmond, Virginia, it's a straight shot. You're on a straight southerly march. You'll be there in no time. McClellan doesn't do this. Instead, he comes up with this overly elaborate idea of the Peninsular Campaign. Instead of just marching his troops south, he loads all of the Union Army and their supplies up onto boats, and he sails them a short distance out of the Chesapeake Bay and wraps them right back around and lands them on a peninsula in Virginia. And so now he has to deal with 400 ships, 130,000 Union troops. It's this huge logistical nightmare, to be honest, and he doesn't need to do it. There's no reason for it. But what he's doing is he's buying time, and he's deliberately sort of going around Lincoln's orders here. And so once they've landed, McClellan and his troops hold up on this peninsula in Virginia, and they still are stalling on this attack. This gives the Confederates the chance to bring 17,000 troops in to defend Richmond. Now, because of this, Lincoln is forced to withhold 30,000 more soldiers that he could have sent down directly at Richmond to help try to crush the capital of the Confederacy. He has to hold them back to protect Washington, D.C., because now the Confederate troops are stronger in Northern Virginia. So, when McClellan finally launches his attack, and he goes after the city of Richmond, it's too late. It's too well defended. He's going to go over there and fight, but nobody wins. They're basically going to fight to a stalemate. So what this shows is that McClellan has now squandered this opportunity to go ahead and really strike a blow at the heart of the Confederacy, to basically take their capital away from them. And it's all because he is constantly having this sort of spitting match, to use friendlier terms than we're all used to, with Abraham Lincoln. Now, ultimately, during this campaign, Robert E. Lee, the very famous commander that we're all familiar with today, will be put in command of the armies of Northern Virginia. And so he is going to lead them on to some very, very key victories immediately after that. He's going to be able to win the Second Battle of Bull Run, where they'll engage again at Manassas, Virginia with Northern troops. He's going to win the Battle of Fair Oaks and the 7 Days Battle. These are all critical battles that are being won, that really the South shouldn't be winning all these battles. They shouldn't be gaining this momentum. They're outgunned. They're outmanned. But because he's a great military leader and McClellan's constantly fighting with Lincoln, the North is squandering these opportunities to bring a decisive end to this war in its early years. Now, McClellan is still going to be forced to retreat to the Virginia-D.C. border. And despite the fact that he has really blown this opportunity to take Richmond, he is going to basically still be in charge of the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln knows he can't get rid of McClellan because McClellan's troops love him too much. So while this is all going on, Lincoln starts talking about this idea of emancipation. He starts considering this idea. He has always been talking about how the war has been there to maintain the Union, but he is also playing with this idea of emancipating the slaves in the South. And he knows that if he does this while the Union is losing battles, it's going to look like a desperate measure, and it's going to be a blow to people's confidence in the Union's ability to win this war. But in mid-September of 1862, the Battle of Antietam will take place in Sharpsburg, Maryland. And Lincoln's thinking, this is it. When we win at Antietam, this is when I'll be able to announce emancipation. But McClellan, again, is going to be indecisive, and he's going to squander another chance at a clear victory, and they're going to fight to a stalemate there at Antietam as well. Now, ultimately, Lee's forces basically had to fall back to Virginia after Antietam. A common recurring theme throughout this war is that the South is going to make small and sporadic attacks into Northern territory, but for the most part, they do not have the manpower to create a sustained offensive in the North. So Lee is going to march his troops back to Virginia to regroup and resupply. And then Lincoln is finally going to have to acknowledge that McClellan is not the man for the job, and he's going to fire him, remove him from command of the Army of the Potomac. So the Battle of Antietam was the single deadliest day in the Civil War in the United States. Over 6,000 people would die and 17,000 troops would be wounded at Antietam. More casualties on the northern side than the southern side. And this is going to be a massive PR nightmare for Abraham Lincoln. Instead of being able to have this huge victory after which he can announce emancipation, he now is having to explain why they have yet again lost what should have been a clear victory. Shortly after Antietam in 1862, Lincoln is going to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He realizes he can't wait anymore. This is something that needs to be done. It's important to understand what this is. There's a lot of misconceptions surrounding the Emancipation Proclamation. It does not free slaves in the United States of America. It is not a law. It is a war document. What this war document does is it frees any slaves who are living in Confederate territory. So what that means is that Lincoln is making an order, and he's saying, if you're a slave living in the Confederacy, you're free. You're free to walk off the plantation and leave. But there's a problem with this. Here's the issue. Lincoln is no longer in charge of the Confederate States. Lincoln is not the president of the Confederate States. He's the president of the United States. And so ultimately what's going on here is that Lincoln is issuing this order, but it's of limited efficacy. And another important thing to point out is that slaves are not waiting for Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Slaves are not sitting there going, I hope he issues an order soon and then we'll walk off the plantation. As soon as the Union Army moves into any area of the South, the slaves emancipate themselves. Again, it's important to see them not as non-actors, but as active participants in their own lives. They're not going to sit around and wait for a piece of paper to free them. They are leaving the plantation. Over 1 million slaves had left the plantations in the South before this order had ever been issued. But another thing to point out is that Emancipation Proclamation does not free slaves in the United States. If you're a slave in Maryland and the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, you're still a slave in Maryland. You're still a slave in Delaware. You're still a slave in Missouri, and you're still a slave in Kentucky. And so it has no bearing on the legality of slavery in the United States. It is simply a war measure meant to undercut the economic backbone of the Confederacy, which is slavery. It's intended to get more slaves, to embolden slaves to get up and leave the plantation, something they'd already been doing. So, in a wider sense, this is going to have an impact on the Northern outlook on the war. What's going to happen here is that this war is no longer about secession and maintenance of the Union. That rhetoric will always be there. It's there throughout the war. But it shifts the way that the North is thinking about this war. More and more people in the North start to see this war as being about slavery, truly about the core issue at hand, and that is slavery. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this mini lecture video is Northern Democrats. These are sort of a rarity during the war, but it is important to understand that the North it still has pockets of Democratic politicians operating therein. So really, the North is associating the Democratic Party with slavery, with the Confederacy, with secession. But there are still, like I said, small areas of the North where Democrats enjoy some political support. Most of the Democrats in the North approve of the war effort. They support Lincoln. They support the Union. One of those is going to be Lincoln's vice president, a guy by the name of Andrew Johnson, was somebody we're going to be talking about a little bit in Reconstruction. But there are other Democrats in the North that are referred to historically as Copperheads. In their own time, they called themselves Peace Democrats. These are Democrats that are arguing for an immediate ceasefire in the war, for a return to diplomacy, that the North and South should start working together to find a diplomatic solution and a non-military solution to these problems. And they're saying that the North should basically just say, hey, look, ultimately, if you want to have slaves, then we should allow you to have slaves. And so they call themselves Peace Democrats, but they're named after the poisonous snake. That's how a lot of Northerners see these Democrats. They're seen as being snakes in the grass, people in our midst that'll strike out and attack us, that'll attack at the heart of what this war is really all about. And so they say, the Copperheads are even saying, if this results in an independent Confederacy where slavery is legal, then so be it. The war just needs to come to an end. So Lincoln is going to ultimately start looking at these individuals as treasonous or seditious. And he actually starts throwing them in jail and locking them up without trials for the remainder of the war. A big example of this is a guy by the name of Clement Vallandigham. He's an Ohio congressman, and he's a very outspoken Peace Democrat or Copperhead. He's going to be arrested in May of 1863, immediately after making a speech in which he says, if the South wants to be independent, let them be independent. But again, this creates a problem for Lincoln. He's locking up people for saying things that he doesn't like. This is a violation of their inalienable rights, of their constitutional rights. And again, this provides more fodder to the South who's saying, that's Lincoln, that's King Lincoln. When King Lincoln doesn't like something, King Lincoln changes the rules. He changes the laws. He doesn't care about people's rights and he doesn't care about the Constitution. He cares about African Americans and he wants to enslave whites. That's really what Lincoln's all about. And so again, that is continuing to push this rhetoric forward in the South. Lincoln is taking these actions because he feels that it is necessary to maintain the war effort, but it is going to consistently be used against him, and it will reinforce that vision of who Lincoln really is in the American South. So that's where I'm going to wrap up this particular lecture. When in the next mini lecture, we're going to be talking about conscription and the draft riots and moving on to some of the campaigns in the later war. Okay, everyone, this will pretty much bring the mini lectures and really our course to a close here. This will be the last thing we talk about in History 1305. And so now we're dealing with the issue of Reconstruction. The Confederates had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war has come to a close, and now the country is sort of left with this issue of how do we put the pieces back together. This was a brutal, drawn-out war, and over 650,000 Americans had died in the Civil War on both sides. And so obviously there's a lot of bad blood. And there's going to be some political schisms going on here as well. And the key ones that you need to be aware of before we get into all of this, just to get the background, is that in the North you have now, you still only have Union states that are politically active in the Northern legislature, in the federal legislature, I should say. And you have what are known as moderate Republicans, people like Lincoln, who are looking to drive forward their plans for Reconstruction. And generally, the moderate Republicans are thinking, we want to quickly put this country back together. We want to get over this horror of the Civil War and just move on with our lives. Let's just put it behind us and get on with it. Then you also have what are known as radical Republicans. Radical Republicans are people who want to rebuild the country and put it back together, but they also want to punish the South. These people are angry. The North is angry. No one in the North was untouched by this war. Everybody lost someone, a brother, an uncle, a cousin. Somebody had died in the course of this war, and they are really upset. They want vengeance. And so the radical Republicans have a few key goals. They want to control Reconstruction. They want to punish any former Confederates. They want to ensure the rights of freedmen or African Americans who are going to be emancipated from slavery. And then ultimately, they are going to also want to ensure that Southern Democrats, the other political party that's still floating around out there, they want to make sure Southern Democrats never regain political office. They have a few different reasons for this. One, that's their political rival, the Democratic Party. But two, there's also the issue of if Southern Democrats come back into power, then the old South is going to come back. The slaveocracy, the racism, all of the things that we think of in the slavery era are going to be ushered back in with the Southern Democrats. And to kind of spoil the surprise for you, that's exactly what's going to happen. The Southern Democrats are going to come back into power in the southern states, and they're eventually going to take over one of the houses of Congress by the time that we get to the end of Reconstruction. And so they will be, that's how the Democratic Party is going to survive, is they're going to be ushered back in by rejecting the overtures of Republican politicians during Reconstruction. And again, as I said, the big picture, what you need to take away from all of this is why racial problems in America weren't solved after the Civil War. This is why they are going to linger into the 20th century, and there's the need for a civil rights movement. There's the need to continue to address these problems of racial inequality. And it's because of the policies that Southern Democrats enacted during Reconstruction, because Republicans didn't successfully see this plan through and protect the rights of freedmen. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to leave you to read the chapter on Reconstruction. It's going to deal with the whole comprehensive picture of it. Anybody who goes on and takes History 1306 will probably start with Reconstruction as well. So all I'm trying to do in this brief video is hit the high points that are most likely to appear on your exam, the ones I really want to drive home. And so we need to start with the Reconstruction Amendments because actually the 13th Amendment, the first of the Reconstruction Amendments, actually happens in the midst of the Civil War, right during the middle of Sherman's March to the Sea. In late 1864 and early 1865, Lincoln and the moderate Republicans were able to work together with radical Republicans to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Now, this, as I mentioned, is the first of the Reconstruction Amendments. And the Reconstruction Amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States collectively. When you put those three amendments together, we label those the Reconstruction Amendments. It is critically important that you keep these Reconstruction Amendments separate in your head from what are known as the Reconstruction Acts. They are completely unrelated, and they do not, if you answer affirmatively with one instead of the other on the exam, you're going to miss points. So what we're seeing here with the 13th Amendment is that this is the only Reconstruction Amendment to be passed before Lincoln's assassination, and this is his baby. If you had the patience to sit through that 3-hour movie, Lincoln, this is pretty much what it was all about, his push to get the 13th Amendment passed. The problem here is that Lincoln went ahead and remember, Lincoln's a lawyer. He understands the law. In the midst of the war, he went ahead and did something that was completely illegal. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, in which he said the slaves living in Confederate territory will now and forever be free. He can't actually do that. And so here is the problem. He has done something that is illegal, but he's promised these people their freedom. They've left the plantation. It's over. They're out of slavery. But how does he ensure that they're not taken back into slavery? He has to get this amendment passed. And so when he's successful at doing this, this is the crowning achievement of Lincoln's presidency. The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. This is why we cannot legally allow slavery in this country anymore. But there is a caveat. And this caveat is important because it's going to be exploited by the Southern Democrats who are coming back into power during Reconstruction in the later phase. It says, slavery and involuntary servitude is illegal and outlawed in the U.S., except if you've been convicted of a crime. If you've been convicted of a crime, you can be put back onto a plantation. And so the South is eventually going to come and exploit this. They're going to start arbitrarily arresting African Americans and going, well, we've convicted you with an all-white jury, a biased jury, and now we're able to throw you back into slavery. And so that's what the 13th Amendment is all about. And again, what you're going to see, there's a pattern here. Republicans in the North will pass these laws intended to protect African Americans, and the South is going to find loopholes, and they're going to exploit those loopholes to deny African Americans their constitutional rights. And this is the first example we're seeing of that. Now, we're going to be going through all of the Reconstruction amendments, but there's another important body being established on the ground in the South. You have these politicians in the North are sitting up there making legislation. They're going, we passed this law and we passed that law. Laws don't mean anything if they can't be enforced. And they also don't mean anything if you don't have a mechanism to enact them. And so the law and order aspect of what's going on in the South is, as the war comes to an end, the Union Army is put in charge of the South. They are going to basically, the whole South is under martial law. There is no civil government in the South because they all broke away and joined the Confederacy. They're all treasonous. They're all seditious. And so there are no politicians. There's no leadership left in the South. So the Union Army is in control, but the Freedmen's Bureau would be established in March of 1865. And it's being passed when you have mostly Republicans in charge of Congress. The agency would become the foundation of Reconstruction plans on the ground in the South. It would be performing a lot of very practical and critical tasks in the war-ravaged South. First, the Bureau is going to become a safety net to help economically suffering African Americans. You have now given them freedom because the 13th Amendment's been passed. But as a result, you've also severed their ties to their only homes that they've ever known. You have a massive homelessness problem after the war amongst African Americans because their homes were the plantations and they can no longer go to the plantations. And so ultimately, African American families are struggling. They need a place to stay. The Freedmen's Bureau is essentially going to be setting up refugee camps for them as it sort of is practically acted out on the ground. They're delivering food. They're delivering medicine. That's a really critical part of what the Freedmen's Bureau does. Now, the Bureau is also going to be instrumental in building schools for African American children in the South. Many of these kids are going to become the first kids in their family who ever gain literacy. In addition to that, a lot of the historically black colleges and universities that you see around today would be established under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureaus. So the HCBUs get their starts with funding from the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau is also going to be put in charge of managing federally confiscated lands. This might not seem like a big deal to you, but it is. All of the lands that were taken away by Sherman during his march to the sea are going, all the lands that the Confederates lost during the Civil War, they're now under the control of the Freedmen's Bureaus. And the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be using it to help African Americans who are struggling on the ground. In essence, the Bureau really becomes the first effort by the United States government to establish social welfare sort of structures and really help people on the ground. They're helping to sort of fix these problems with disenfranchised African Americans. And so it's a critically important unit of Reconstruction. Now, I know I'm jumping around and kind of moving fast here, but most of you probably know Lincoln doesn't live too long to see Reconstruction play out. It kind of gives rise to the old joke, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? But Lincoln, if you don't know, was assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer by the name of John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater in 1865. Now, he had picked a vice president in Andrew Johnson as part of what they call a national unity ticket. In other words, what he was trying to do is say, I'm a Republican, I'm from Illinois in the North, I need somebody who's going to make us look like we're a unified front. I need someone who's different from me as my vice president. And he picks Andrew Johnson. Johnson was brought up in slaveholding North Carolina. He was a Southern Democrat, but he remained really loyal to the Union throughout the war as a representative from the state of Tennessee. So when Lincoln goes up for his second election and his second term, he picks Johnson as a vice president. Now, Johnson will be remembered for what is known as presidential Reconstruction, and he's also remembered as the veto president. So he would constantly be in conflict with the Republicans who are controlling Congress at this point. It looks at first like he might actually kind of carry on the responsible plan of Reconstruction that Lincoln had laid out. But when he gets into office, he immediately flips a switch and he becomes very much the slave-holding sympathizer, the Confederate sympathizer that you would think he would be. And he's going to constantly be vetoing any legislation that Republicans are putting on his desk to try to help African Americans in the Reconstruction process. So moving on through our slideshow, our PowerPoint presentation, we're looking at Johnson's approach to Reconstruction. The radical Republicans are saying, we want the South punished, and we want the people involved in the Confederacy punished before we can even start talking about bringing these southern states back in. Moderate Republicans are saying, we just need to find a responsible way to make sure that Southern Democrats and the people who led this Confederacy don't come back into power. Johnson gets into the presidency and he says, I want you all to just reform your governments however you want, elect whoever you want. I don't care if they were part of the Confederate government or not. Just elect them, reform your governments, and reapply for statehood. It's an incredibly haphazard plan. So he was incredibly lenient on any former Confederates. He doesn't make them get pardons. He doesn't ask for oaths of loyalty like other people are doing. And he constantly is trying to undercut the efforts of radical Republicans who are looking out for the safety and well-being and the rights of the freedmen in the South, the freed African Americans. Under Johnson's presidency, you will see a number of southern states elect numerous former Confederates to public office. And these states start to enact what are known as black codes. They start to become established all throughout the South. Out of everything I'm talking about in Reconstruction, there are some critical points, and the black codes are one of those critical points. What the black codes are mechanisms used in the South to fight Reconstruction plans, to fight rights being given to African Americans. What they're all about is they're saying, oh, the North is giving you all these rights. Well, we're going to enact a black code. And if you were to pick one of these up and read them, on the surface, it looks like it's for the well-being of African Americans. They'll say things like, we don't want violence to erupt amongst African Americans. We'd hate for people to get shot or killed. So African Americans aren't allowed to have guns. Violation of their Second Amendment rights. Now, they're going to say things like, we would hate for African Americans to get into courts of law and incriminate themselves unfairly because they don't understand the legal system. So we're not going to let them testify. We're not going to let them be witnesses. We're not going to let them bring lawsuits in courts of law, denying them their citizenship rights. They're going to start imposing things like literacy tests and poll taxes to make sure that African Americans can't vote. They're going to start to pass anti-miscegenation laws under these black codes, saying that blacks and whites can't get married to one another. They're going to say, we want to make sure that African Americans have a space to live within our southern cities. So we're going to give them this part of the city over here. That's something we call segregation. And so what you're seeing is that these black codes, they look well-meaning. If you don't know what you're looking at and you were just to pick it up and read it, you would think it was for the protection of African Americans. It is not. These codes are used to deny African Americans the rights that are being granted to them by Republicans in the North. This is the mechanism through which Southern Democrats are going to rebuild the old South, the antebellum South, the South of slavery, the slavocracy, and the plantation culture. So ultimately, Johnson is going to be the one who oversees all of this, but there would be a number of executive and legislative battles. The Republicans in Congress hate Johnson. They're always fighting with him over Reconstruction plans. They're saying exactly what I just said. If we allow Johnson's plan to take hold, the Old South's going to come right back in. So when Congress reconvenes in 1866, Republicans refused to recognize any of the representatives who were elected under Johnson's presidential Reconstruction plan. They're going to say, basically, if you want to rejoin the Union, you come through Congress. You don't go to the president. President Johnson doesn't say how you get admission to the Union. We do. And so, despite the fact that Johnson kept trying to veto every act that came across his desk from Congress, Congress would be successful in expanding and extending the scope of the Freedmen's Bureau, and they would be successful at passing America's first Civil Rights Act in 1866, saying that you cannot discriminate against somebody based on their race. So Republicans are basically going to continue to watch Johnson try to veto this legislation, and they're concerned. They've passed this Civil Rights Act saying that African Americans have rights just like a normal American, white American citizen. They have the same rights, same everything. And then they look at this and they say, here's the problem. If Southern Democrats ever do get back into power, an act can be balled up and thrown in the trash. Because of that, they make it their top priority in 1866 to pass the 14th Amendment. They want to make sure that if ever Southern Democrats came back into power, that they could not get rid of this amendment. Amendments can't be balled up and thrown in the trash. Acts can. And so the 14th Amendment redefined the role that the federal government played in protecting individual citizenship rights. The 14th Amendment states that all former slaves would be granted immediate citizenship in the United States, that all citizens were entitled to equal protection under the law, that states that refused to give citizens, including African American men, the right to vote, they would lose their congressional representation. In other words, if Alabama wants to deny African Americans the right to vote, then the United States government will take away representation from Alabama. They don't get votes in Congress anymore. So all former Confederates would need to sign a specific congressional pardon to hold office under the 14th Amendment, and former slave owners could not be compensated by the state or federal government for their losses that happened during the war. In other words, we're not going to pay you for the slaves that were taken away from you when they were freed. That's what the 14th Amendment is all about. So just to recap, to get the big picture here, the 13th Amendment makes slavery and indentured servitude illegal. The 14th Amendment is going to grant African Americans their citizenship rights. So it's important that you keep those things straight. Now, I'm going to make things a little difficult for you. I'm going to come in and talk about these Reconstruction Acts. These are totally unrelated to the Reconstruction Amendments. But what the Reconstruction Acts are all about is they're a way for radical Republicans to undo what Johnson had done. It's a way for Congress to take control of Reconstruction again and get it away from Andrew Johnson. And in 1867, they're going to pass 4 Reconstruction Acts. The first one had basically divided the South into 5 military districts, and it put them all under martial law. They're all under the rule of the Union Army until they could ultimately regain peace in these territories. Once peace was established, Congress overhauled the process for applying for stateship in the Union. Basically, what they're saying is that all of the previous policies that Johnson put in place for coming back into the United States, they're gone. And then new states would need to include a provision guaranteeing universal male suffrage, meaning that all the states that come back in have to promise they're going to let African American males vote. So, once Congress had approved a state's constitution and that state had accepted the 14th Amendment that had just recently been passed, they could then be reconsidered for admission in the Union. So that's what the Reconstruction Acts are all about. Remember, you got to keep them separate from the amendments. So another kind of key idea, there's some key terms you need to understand about rebuilding the Republican Party in the South, or building it in the first place, really. Republicans were never in the South because the South was pro-slavery and Republicans were abolitionists. So there's going to be some key groups of people that are going to have to go there in order to build a Republican Party base in the South. The first you have are known as carpetbaggers. These are northern businessmen and politicians who relocated from the North and moved into the South after the war. And they would be voting for the Republican Party. They're called carpetbaggers because they're carrying suitcase that looks like bags made out of carpet. You also have scalawags. These are few and far between. What scalawags are is they are white Southerners who are against slavery. There's not a lot of them, but they did exist. And so they would be out there basically voting Republican because they believed in the anti-slavery message. And the final group that you have included in here are the freedmen. The freedmen are naturally going to be voting Republican because the Republican Party is the one that emancipated them from slavery. They don't vote for Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats want to oppress and hold them down. And so all of those groups are the formation of a Republican Party in the American South after the war. And if you're following with me on the next slide, you're seeing the Southern reactions to Republicans in the South. Now, many of you probably don't know this, but the Ku Klux Klan, it was formed in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1867, made up of former Confederates. The Ku Klux Klan has undergone a number of changes over the years. They actually have different manifestations. If I'm not mistaken, the Klan that exists in modern-day America is the third manifestation of the Ku Klux Klan. The first manifestation comes during the Reconstruction period. They're there to terrorize African Americans. They are there to create problems for African American families, to threaten them, to try and stop them from voting. But really, there is a political aim to the first Ku Klux Klan that later manifestations of it don't have. They are looking to suppress Republican votes. A scalawag is as much at risk from the Ku Klux Klan as is a freedman because they both vote Republican. Really, the Klan becomes a mouthpiece of the Democratic Party in the South. It's actually an armed wing of the Democratic Party in a lot of ways. And so the Ku Klux Klan is going to rise up during this period, as does organizations like the White League. They're there to try to terrorize African Americans, but also to suppress Southerners and people living in the South from voting Republican. That's really what they're all about. So again, I'm moving quickly, but I do want to wrap this up for you all and just touch on these key ideas. Now, the final Reconstruction Amendment is the 15th Amendment. This occurs shortly after Ulysses S. Grant, the former general, has been elected as president. He's a Republican candidate. He's elected to president, and the Republicans set about tightening the language surrounding universal male suffrage in the U.S. Constitution. The 14th Amendment implied that African American males would get the right to vote because they're getting all of the citizenship rights, and voting is a citizenship right. But the South, they fought back against that. They said voting's not a right, it's a privilege. Not everybody gets the right. Women don't get the right to vote. People under the age of 21 don't get the right to vote. So they started denying African Americans this right. This is what makes the 15th Amendment necessary. The 15th Amendment ultimately guaranteed that a person's race or previous condition of servitude, which is what the South was using to bar them from voting, could not stop them from voting or the rights naturally enjoyed by citizens of the U.S. So to recap, the 13th Amendment ends slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment guarantees African Americans citizenship rights, and the 15th Amendment of 1870 guarantees voting rights for African Americans. So, we've hit most of the high points here, but the last thing I want to talk about is the end of Reconstruction. By 1876, the black codes have been effective. Johnson's haphazard plans for Reconstruction have been somewhat effective before the Republicans could stop it. And Southern Democrats have been swept back into state office all over the South, and they had also taken control of Congress at this point in time. So the old conservative white planter class had come back in to dominate all of the state governments in the South, and they now had a voice on a national level. They could now enact federal policies again. The Republicans now have an opponent in national politics. Additionally, you had the rise of the Redeemers and the Mississippi Plan, which are covered in your textbook. They are spreading fear and terror all over the South. But all of this going on, you now have the return of the old slaveocracy. But the South had also met conditions by 1877, the end date for our course, to where Grant starts pulling the Union troops out of the South, and there is a return to civil government. And so that's what brings Reconstruction to an end. When we come out of it, you're going to see that life for African Americans did not get sizably better in the South. Because the Southern Democrats had swept back into office, because the South had been successful at finding caveats and loopholes in federal legislation that had been passed by Republicans, the problems for African Americans are going to continue in the U.S. South. Well, that is where I'm going to wrap things up. This segues you nicely into History 1306 if you're going on to take it. If you have any questions about any of this material, be sure to email me. It is going to show up on the final exam. But I hope you enjoyed the class. I hope you're all staying safe, staying well out there. This is the last time I get to address you through a video. So best of luck to you all in your future careers, your educational endeavors. And don't be a stranger. If you ever have any questions about history, not just U.S., but world or African history, which you probably have forgotten by now is actually what I do, feel free to drop me an email, pop by my office. I'm always open to old students. So I'll still be communicating with you through Blackboard. I'll still be putting up the study guide for our final exam. I'll still be answering any questions you might have. And don't forget about the signature assignment that will be due on April 26th. I'll be talking to you about that in the following week as well. I hope you all take care, and I wish you the best of luck.